Hello everyone, this is Deepthi from Sri Venkateswara College of Engineering, Bengaluru. Today I'll be presenting a seminar on health risk associated with 5G exposure, a view from communication engineering perspective. Before we start, let us see what are the contents we'll be covering today. The introduction to the topic, extensive literature survey, objectives, proposed methodology, advantages and disadvantages, research, conclusion and references. Introduction. We all know that the globe is experiencing huge amount of data because of increasing mobile subscribers, various online platform which requires high data transfer rate. The deployment of 5G is the fundamental step to enable variety of services across this world. And all the deployment of 5G comes with greater throughput, more bandwidth in higher frequency, especially in millimeter waves. And deploying of 5G requires installation of 5G base stations and diffusion of user equipment among all the users. And the fear of 5G technology is mainly due to biased feeling among the population. To deploy the current system to 5G system, the system should face three major changes, which leads to increasing amount of radio frequency and electromagnetic frequency exposure. First, to provide a extremely high data transfer, the 5G system needs a high signal power at a receiver to direct energy effectively where needed. So therefore, the EMF will increase and the users will be in direct contact with the EMF. Second, the number of transmitters that operate at the base station is anticipated to increase, which means more base stations will be developed because millimeter wave has a very short wavelength and millimeter wave signals may be absorbed and dispersed and depolarized and diffracted by the weather. These base stations will provide a connection for smaller area and will be located near the users. Therefore, this will result in higher chance of user being exposed to EMF. And then third, the narrow beam will be utilized in the 5G system as the solution for a high attenuation of signal due to power operation and frequency bands. To increase the antenna's gain in the 5G system, multiple antennas are used. And we adopt 5G communication engineering perspective as the glue that links the research work from the different fields into a unique big picture. Clearly, our goal is not to compete with the communication efforts done by health agencies on the theme, but rather to add another voice to the wide topic of health risk assessment of 5G exposure. Communication engineering can provide insights about realistic patterns of power radiated by 5G equipments, allowing the realistic assessment of 5G exposure. The communication engineering can drive the design of 5G equipment and protocols tailored by the minimization of EMFs and consequently of the health risks. And in a nutshell, communication engineering is a passive part out of to analyze the health risk of 5G. Now, moving on to literature survey, the first paper we have referred here is Health Risk Associated with 5G Exposure, a view from communication engineering perspective, which was published in the year 2021. In this work, we analyze the health risk associated with 5G exposure by adopting a new comprehensive viewpoint based on the communication engineering perspective. And we also precisely examine the up-to-date metrics, regulations, and assessment of compilation procedure for 5G exposure by evaluating the latest guidelines. The second paper here we have referred as RMEMF, that is radio frequency electromagnetic field exposure measurement for 5G over millimeter wave base station with massive input, massive output antenna, which was published in the year 2022. And this study aims to measure the maximum exposure emitted by 5G millimeter wave base station by utilizing international standards in both its assessment methodology and exposure limit. And the investigation is based on code selective method due to the radiated power fluctuation over time with data traffic. The objectives of the paper or the study here is to analyze the medical research focused on long-term electromagnetic field exposure by exploiting the 5G communication engineering knowledge, to analyze the main 5G and beyond 5G technology features and their potential impact on the high health risk, to understand the overview of the methods to assess the exposure compliance with respect to the maximum limits when considering 5G equipment, to discuss the mitigation techniques based on communication engineering that can be implemented to reduce the health risk of 5G. Methodology. Here we have divided our work into 4 different parts, where it covers where the first part covers about the health effects from 5G exposure, and the second part covers the regulation of and compliances of assessment, and the third part covers the health risk associated with 5G features, and the fourth part covers the um, risk mitigation technique for 5G exposure. Basic principles of radio frequency exposure is that the exposure of EMF can be categorized into 2 types, that is ionized and non-ionizing radiation. In ionizing radiation, the living cells will be ionized because of the radiations, and depending on the dose levels, the cells will be exposed to ionizing radiation, and which are exposed to ionizing radiation may die or may become cancerous, and this will affect the health of an individual in that case. And the electromagnetic field that is belonging to non-ionizing radiation, they don't really ionize the cells, and they don't have any effects of cancer or death for the exposed cells. And the comprehensive approach that covers the health risk associated with the exposure from both 5G and GNB, we can see here in this picture. The left part of this picture here shows that main health effects that are alleged as the consequences of exposure from RF devices. Glioma and schwannoma tumors have been observed, and only in animals exposed to high levels of electromagnetic field, while in right part, the primary sources of EMF exposure when considering mobile network equipment, the EMF exposure from UV tends to be higher and more localized on the body than the one from radio base stations. Moreover, the EMF intensity rapidly decreases as the distance between the base station and the user is increased, and the buildings are introduced a shielding effect that attenuates the exposure from outdoor base stations here. Yeah, so moving on. The 5G exposure matrices, we can see matrices such as electromagnetic field strength, that is it is computed as an average from different points in the space, and power density, and we have specific absorption rate, that is it is a time derivative of energy consumed by heating that is absorbed by a mass including a volume of given mass density. And alleged health effects from RF exposure, we can see cancer, we can see skin effects, and high doses of observed radio frequency exposure can cause sensation of warmth in the skin and causing mild skin burns. Ocular effects, that is high levels of RF exposure with sufficiently high power density may cause several ocular effects. Male fertility, according to the subset of studies, high level of RF exposure may be associated with negative effects on reproductive health in terms of sperm fertilizing ability. Relevant medical studies in the context of 5G communication. Yeah, it is divided into two. The experiments are based on two animal-based studies and population-based studies. In animal-based studies, the exposed EMF, the rats or living animals are exposed to EMF to mimic the exposure of base stations and user equipments. And in population-based studies, the studies belonging to this category aim to investigating the relationship between people affected by severe diseases like brain tumors and a level exposure from base station or user equipment. The base station represent a minor source of exposure compared to UE, and the exposure from base station tend to be notably reduced as distance between the base station and the user is increased. Review of studies from the perspective of 5G communication. The study is based on, again, classified as animal-based studies and population-based studies. In animal-based studies, we compare NTP and Ramazzini Institute studies against 5G equipment under following key metrics, that is operating frequency, test chambers versus real deployment, and maximum radiated power management, electromagnetic field exposure level, SAR level, transmission and modulation techniques. And while in a 5G exposure regulation and compliance assessment procedure, a key aspect to minimize health risk is the verification of compliance with regulatory limits. To face this point, we focus on these aspects, that is analysis of international guidelines defining limits on 5G exposure, analysis of impact of national regulation on health risk, overview of policies to assess the exposure compliances of 5G equipment with respect to limits, and high health risk associated with 5G features. Some of the 5G features that are found to be associated with health risk are extensive adoption of massive multiple input, multiple output, and beamforming, densification of 5G sites over the territory, adoption of frequencies in millimeter wave bands, connection of millions of IoT devices, coexistence of 5G with legal technology, risk mitigation technology for 5G exposure, device-based solution aimed at designing SAR-aware 5G user equipment and electromagnetic field-aware G-Node Bs, architectural-based approach aimed at reducing risk by introducing new architectural features in 5G and beyond 5G networks, network-based solution aimed at developing electromagnetic field-aware planning solution for cellular networks. Regulation-based approaches are targeting risk reduction through the dismission of legacy 2G, 3G, 4G networks, harmonization of exposure limits, compliances of assessment process across the countries, and defining of constraint to limit the emission from non-cellular radio frequency sources, and EMF measurement campaign and EMF data integration across national and international databases. Advantages of this study is critical examination of health risk. And engineering perspective, that paper takes an engineering approach to analyze the potential health risk associated with 5G exposure. Broad scope, the paper examines a wide range of potential health risk associated with 5G exposure, including thermal effects, non-thermal effects, and the impact on the human immune system. Impartial analysis, the paper is written from an impartial perspective, and the authors do not have any conflicts of interest that might bias their analysis, and useful information of policy for policymakers. Disadvantages is that false claim about health risks. Since the release of 5G, many false claim about its health appeared on social media, such as COVID vaccine contain 5G microchips, and 5G release is used to cover up COVID-19 pandemic and all that. And it does not address the potential impact of 5G on wildlife and ecosystem. It does not address the potential social and economic impacts on this technology. And concluding the paper, the work is suggesting that the health concern about the deployment of 5G G-Node Bs and 5G user equipments are not supported by communication engineering evidences. Therefore, there is no compelling motivation to stop the deployment of 5G network, especially when precautionary principles are applied. However, we point out the importance of continuing to research possible health effects of 5G devices. Clearly, we advocate the further research works that aim to design the 5G exposure aware cellular networks for 5G and beyond system properly. Thank you.